So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Craig Sipes, and I am the STEAM coordinator for Local District East. And I'm very fortunate to be here today with my colleagues, of whom will introduce themselves now. Kirsty.
Hi, I'm Kirsty Hernandez. I am the secondary science coach for the northern community of schools, so Lincoln Heights, El Sereno, East LA, and Boyle Heights.
Hi everyone, I'm Lillian and I support the schools from Huntington Park, Walnut Park, and City of Vernon.
So today we are on PD3 of a four-part series. The four-part series is on the ambitious science teaching practices, and today's number 3 is on supporting ongoing changes in students' thinking. This is a really big one, really good one in terms of really getting kids to think about what is it they're doing, why they're doing it, and make sense of things. There's a big sense-making PD. All right. So to start off with, which teacher do you most feel like today? We're going to do a waterfall in the chat. So please, in the chat, type a number that corresponds to the teacher that you're feeling like today. And don't hit return yet. We're going to hit return on the count of 3. So I'll give you a second to look at the different pictures. You probably recognize most of them from TV. I'll give you another minute here, another couple seconds, and 3, 2, 1, enter. All right. So we're seeing lots of 2s. Who's 2 again?
She's from Recess.
Kirsty. What's her name?
I have no idea what her name is. I just know she's from the TV show Recess, which is a cartoon.
Okay, and nobody put Breaking Bad, so that's good. That's
Someone
good.
said 9. I saw a 9 somewhere. That's a funny one.
Good. All right. Good. So today the engaged participant outcomes are going to be to ensure that students understand why the activity that they're doing makes sense and how it connects to the unit, and to help students bridge the activity with a larger science idea, and to support the development of students' academic language using the activity as a context. All right. So we ask that as you're participating today, it's just like in person, which means that we're all in, and then we'll ask that you remain muted until we ask for verbal participation, but we will ask for that from time to time. So you can respond in chat, you can respond verbally, and if you can keep your cameras on, then that's great because it really helps out. Thank you very much. So Local District East, we have these foci, and our professional development today connects to these foci, and that we're going to continue to connect with making sure that our learning goals are clear to students. So that's a part of what we're doing today. A bigger part of what we're doing today is building the precision of pedagogy. So what are the skills, what are the teacher moves that are going to help our students to successfully implement the science and the engineering practices? Along the way, we will also see connections to student voice. So just to kind of frame this with everything that it is that we're doing, what is NGSS, standards-based instruction? Well, it is 3-dimensional, meaning that there's a knowing part, a doing part, and a thinking part. The DCIs are the knowing part, the SCPs are the doing part, and the CCCs are, well, there's a lot of thinking, but the CCCs in particular are the thinking part. And so this is all about how are students figuring things out? What are students figuring out? How are they figuring it out? And then how does all of that connect to some bigger idea, some bigger phenomenon, and how does that help to build a storyline? So today, everything that we're talking about today is framed within this context. So here's a visual of that context. So we're looking at how can we start something with an anchoring phenomenon, give students opportunities to have some initial ideas that they share, where they can revise their ideas and finalize their ideas. And in between those revisions and finalizations, there's opportunities for them to engage in practice-centered learning activities that help students to construct knowledge. This helps to form the backbone of a unit or a storyline. Our focus for Local District East in terms of student moves for this year are science and engineering practices number 2, 6, and 7, which is developing and using models, constructing explanations, designing solutions, and engaging in argumentation from evidence. These are all things that students do. We call them student moves, how students figure things out. The common thread amongst them is CER, claim, evidence, and reasoning. And how do we enable and empower students to do these? That's through the teacher moves, through the ambitious science teaching practices. That's this PD series, where the first part was we learned about planning for engagement with science ideas, otherwise known as planning from phenomena. Number 2, the second PD that we did was how do we elicit students' ideas? And this third PD today is then once we elicit students' ideas, we don't leave them there with those ideas, then we support them in ongoing changes in thinking. Next time, we're going to learn about how we might press for evidence-based explanations. So all this is building up to support how students can construct really good explanations and argue from evidence and develop and use models, as well as design solutions. So here's another, this is just a different look of the 4 ambitious science teaching practices. We've already done the first 2. And today, supporting ongoing changes in thinking. What does it look like? Students will be using all activities and lessons to explain a phenomenon. Everything builds on another. So the students will understand the building block of a unit. The pieces, the individual pieces serve and function to help construct understanding. They're going to be building that understanding themselves and giving the students the opportunity to revise their thinking based on what they're learning.
Okay, so now we're going to be engaging in an activity. And if you haven't already accessed your own copy of the participant slide deck, I'll place it in the chat once more. There it is. And you're going to be taking a look at 2 different learning activities or learning activities. And so pay attention to the purpose of the activity and also the final product for each. Once you review the activities with your group, determine which, if any, of the activities are sense-making activities. So have a discussion around why it is or is not a sense-making activity, and then try to identify what science and engineering practices the students were able to engage in while participating in each of those activities. So see if you can also cite any specific elements from the progressions to support your answer. So take a look at the 2, and Craig, or would you go to the next slide? So you can see which are the 2 activities you're going to analyze. This is learning activity 1, cell model science project. And then the next one will be learning activity 2. On bread and yeast and bread. Okay, so we're going to have you go into breakout rooms for, we're going to say 8 minutes. Take a look at both activities and identify if they're sense making or not. Any questions? Okay, Kirsty, would you go ahead and launch the breakouts? Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to have a general idea of what might be a sense-making activity by analyzing these 2 learning activities. So here's activity 1. Would anyone like to share if this is a sense-making activity or not? And possibly what science and engineering practice students were engaged in? You can unmute yourself. We're a small group. What do you think?
I'll just say no. This is a basic model activity, and usually students do this after they've already learned everything. So there's no sense making in this one, whereas the other one is an exploration of something they probably haven't learned yet.
Okay, thank you, Boris. Thank you for sharing. So let's take a look at activity 2. And so you will notice that there is an anchoring question. What happens in yeast that makes bread rise? And why does the yeast do this? So would anyone like to share what else they noticed about this learning activity?
I'll share, Ms. Nava.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone. So the first slide was, good old faithful, right? This was the old pre-NGSS modeling activity. And, we used it for so many years and, the kids, enjoyed it. But then learning activity 2, what we were talking in my group is what, they're going to build or not build, but to draw a model like what they predict, what they hypothesize is going to happen. And from my understanding, they're going to be adding to their model as you progress through the lesson or the concept, right? So their model is going to change. And then this leads really good to, having them write a claim supported with evidence, and then their justification and their reasoning. And so we were just in the midst of talking about that when we were called back.
Okay, well, yeah, very good. Thank you, Christina. You summed it up really well. And yeah, so you noticed that anchoring phenomena and how this activity would help help students construct a stronger explanation and maybe even change their thinking from their initial model or their initial thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing. We're going to go ahead and go on to the next slide. So after reviewing the activities, then you might be asking, well, what counts as a sense-making activity? And I did hear that question in the breakout room. So here we go. So here is a non-exhaustive list of activities that can help students make sense of big science ideas. So think about your classroom and which activities have you used before that might be sense-making. I'll just have you just read through the list and think. And if you'd like to type in the chat and share any of these activities that you've done recently with your students, feel free. Okay, Cristina says, work with data tables and graphs to construct a CER. Sonia says populations of wolves over time. Nice. Okay, so we're gonna go on and go to our next slide as and what does not count as an activity. So here is a list of classroom activities that would not count as sense making. And this list doesn't mean that you cannot, use these or do these in the class. However, you can easily adapt them to make them sense making activities for students to explain big ideas. So for example, the validation lab, this is an activity in which the teacher has presented a full explanation of some principle and the students simply carry out an activity and say, voila, it happened just as the teacher said it would. The discovery lab is a lab where teachers have so little structure that they expect the students to stumble upon some explanation or phenomena that took scientists years to formulate. And also drawing models from textbooks, those would not be learning activities, as these are just simple replicas of what they see. That has also taken time to develop by scientists and researchers.
Ms. Nova, let me ask you a question on that one. I have my students build the solar system model, basis up, but it's a lot more than that. I mean, throughout the stuff, they got to identify how many AUs, what's a period rotation, period revolution. They write a paragraph. Why did you chose the colors to represent your planets? I mean, it's Mars because it was iron oxide, so they got to do some investigation. Now, would that count as an activity, or is kind of like in between?
So I think the first question you might want to think about is, so then how is this activity supplementing or part of their anchoring phenomena? That would be part of it. Then also, then it could be, it might be somewhere in the middle, but you did mention like astronomical units. Now, are they doing proportion, like knowing about scale and proportion as well as they're constructing this? Because that might bring it up a little to some sense making. But then again, depending on the overall purpose.
Well, we discussed, AU units when we had demonstration, all that stuff, but it's more informational stuff. How many AUs is this from it? And the paragraph is a little bit writing on it to identify the colors. So they do a little research. Where they get their information, they got to look it up on the internet, or if some will copy off other kids, whatever. But anyway, it seems like it's somewhere in between, the South project to some activity to it.
And Kirsty or Craig, would you like to have any other ideas or suggestions?
I think what Lillian said really kind of focuses on that is, what is the purpose of the activity? Is it tied to that anchoring phenomenon? And that kind of gives you your answer. For it to be a sense-making activity, it really has to have them making sense. And like Lillian's asking scale, proportion, and quantity, like that's a huge deal for the solar system. If they're trying to make sense of the scale of things and how everything is in relation to each other, that definitely could be a sense-making activity. But again, it's the reflection on how am I using this, and what purpose is it serving for my students?
For me, I go back to this slide here. Let me see here. This one, where it's asking here, so what is it that the students are trying to figure out? And that's the DCI, right? But is it the students are figuring something out? What is the figuring out part? And then how are they figuring it out? The answer should be that they're doing it through one of the SCPs. And then how are they thinking about it? And then that connection to why are they trying to figure it out? And so when the answers to these questions land on a DCI, that they're figuring out one of the DCIs, they're doing that through an SCP and thinking like a scientist and engineer through a cross-cutting concept in order to address the phenomenon, then that would be a sense-making activity.
I have a question, Craig. Or
Yes.
Albert. it seems to me that what is a sense-making activity and what is not a sense-making activity seems to be related to the DOK levels. Is that
Yes, if the students are provided with the answer to the question and they don't have to figure it out themselves, then that's, then they don't have to figure it out themselves. They don't have to make sense of it. They already have the answer.
okay,
So right, so DOK 1 is not a sense-making activity.
got it. Got it. Thank you.
No, we're talking about DOK 3 and 4.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty and Craig, for your input as well. So let's go on to slide 15.
15.
Terms to describe classroom activities. Oh, there we go, right there. So here are two important terms that we will be reflecting upon as we continue with our work today. The first is material work, and it's defined as the portion of an activity that is more hands-on, like setting up lab equipment, but has little intellectual or associated little intellectual work associated with it. And then there's intellectual work, which is defined as an activity in which students are working toward making meaning of an idea or observation or phenomena. So for this next activity, we're going to take some time to read a small portion of the Ambitious Science Teaching Primer for supporting ongoing changes in thinking. So you'll take about 5 minutes to read through the section called Being Purposeful About Selecting Activities, and it'll be found on page 3 in the PDF version. So thank you, Kirsty. She's placed the primer in the chat for you. So after about 5 minutes, we're going to place you in a breakout room and reflect on an activity you did in your classroom this week. And think about, what were your students doing? Was it intellectual or was it material? And if students participated in material, consider how might you possibly shift this assignment or activity to turn it into an intellectual work. Or how could the activity be adapted to become a sense-making activity? Okay, so we're gonna set a timer for about 5 minutes and go ahead and read page 3, Being Purposeful About Selecting Activities. Welcome back, everyone. Would anyone briefly like to share out what was discussed in your breakout rooms? What did we learn about selecting activities and how to support their students' ongoing changes in thinking?
Yeah, I'll share out. I mean, it seems like I need
Please,
to do
Ruben.
more make sensing activities, whatever. I mean, I've done some in the past, but this last week, they're more informative if it's through a Neuropod lesson and everything. But I did do the phenomenon out of the book, Unit 4, and we got some discussion going as in what kind of questions would you ask if this weasel and this badger were related, and we got some discussion. So, but the other stuff was more informative. Video, stop the video, answer question, maybe discussion. And there's some things of that nature. Miss Chan had, sounds like her was a sense-making type activity that she did as she explored the moon and the sunlight and where it comes from. But that's what we're discussed in ours.
Thank you for sharing, Ruben.
Okay.
Would anyone like to share what was discussed in their room? Or Ms. Chan, would you tell us a little more about what your students did, if you don't mind?
I'm not sure if it was necessarily sense making. I'm still trying to get like a grasp of that concept as well. But we just had a quick activity where students had like posters with the earth at the center and then sunlight coming from different parts of that poster. And they were given like cards to kind of sort through and show the different moon phases. And so, yeah, they were just able to kind of see, okay, so if the sunlight is coming at this angle or at this part, then how would I orient the cards? And it was just helpful because they didn't necessarily have to like really lean into the vocab. It was kind of like a part of it, but they were able to see the picture of the moon, and that just kind of helped them to become more familiar with the vocabulary as well. Not sure if that's sense making, but yeah, that was just the idea of the activity.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing, Judy. Okay, so we'll go on to our next.
Ms. Nara, let me, this one, I mean, last week or like a week ago, a week and a half or so, I had a nerd pod talking about latitude, longitude, some video clips and stuff like that. And then our activity was they took out the globe, they asked some questions, gave them latitude, longitude, and the kids had to find them and they were locating them and all that. Would that be sense making?
Sense making?
Yeah, I don't know, sense making or making sense. And they're exploring to see how they can locate different places. And then sometimes I said, dream vacation, what will be the coordinates, and have to look at it. Or that does not come under that category. To me, it seemed like an activity, but maybe it's not is. I don't know.
So remember, the main thing is this activity going to support them in constructing their explanation toward that anchoring phenomenon? Was it just an isolated activity, or what they learned from it, is it going to help them in construct or learn more about that phenomenon? So those are questions that you can ask yourself, or say, how can I modify this so that whatever they get out of this will support them?
Yeah, I would say that, it definitely supported the near part lesson on it, but what the near part lesson is, it needs that anchoring phenomenon that we could come back towards it and that will solve it. I mean, the phenomenon is, I don't know, it's like, how do you locate, geographic locations on Earth, or rephrase it something like that. And then by doing that, then they'll come back and answer the phenomena, I guess. So I just got
Could be, if it's investigative. Yeah, it would depend. Yes, just remember your anchoring phenomena is for the whole unit.
And to add on to that, going back to the question of what are students figuring out. So what DCI were students figuring out in that activity?
What's DCI mean? I mean,
disciplinary core idea.
Well, I will have to have a list there of the different core ideas. I'm not quite sure what they are.
So then, but were they figuring out a science idea, or were they practicing a skill?
Practicing a skill.
Okay, so then then they were built. So what they were doing in that activity, I would say, was they would be building a skill, and that's different from figuring something out from a sense making activity. So those would be two different types of activities, I think.
Okay.
Thank you for your questions, Ruben. Those are really good. I'm glad
Thank
you asked.
Thank you for bringing those up. It's really good. It's really good to think about those things. Thank you.
Reflecting on those activities. Yeah, it's great. Okay, and then next slide, Craig. And thank you too, Craig, for your input. And so again, it's important to remember that our main objective is supporting students, supporting changes in students thinking over time. And in order to do this, we must engage students in meaningful activities that help them understand parts of an anchoring phenomenon and engage with big science ideas multiple times throughout the unit. So this is not a one and done kind of a lesson, but rather a series of lessons that help build understanding of a specific phenomenon. And then now up next is Kirsty, who's going to guide you through practice 3.
And before, I'm sorry, before Kirsty does that, once again, I think it's important to note that it's two levels of sense making happening. Right? There's the sense making that's happening in the individual lessons, where you're figuring out individually in the lessons what's going on, and then the sense making across the unit, where the students are figuring out something in the lesson, and then that serves as a puzzle piece in constructing that whole unit. So there's two levels of sense making that's going on in NGSS. Thank you. Kirsty, go ahead.
Thank you, Craig. All right, so the next part is where we're going to really break down and look at the 3 critical areas for this ambitious science teaching practice, which are ideas to reason with, engaging with data or observations, and then using knowledge to revise models and explanations. So in our last practice, we really were eliciting those initial ideas for those models. So now, after having students go through these sense-making activities, we're going to use that to have them use that new knowledge to revise models explanations. So next slide. So the first area is presenting students with ideas to reason with. And this is very different than traditionally providing them with a lecture. When we present them with when we present them with these ideas to reason with, it's for the purpose of giving them just enough information to make sense of the activity that they're doing. If we have students engage in these activities with no context, they won't see these connections and may miss the purpose of the lesson. So similar to what Lillian said, those one and done lessons, they're going to think of it like that and not really understand what they're trying to figure out or its connection to that phenomenon, that double layer of sense making. So as you're preparing for giving them ideas to reason with, some things you can do, plan for only 10 to 15 minutes of instruction. So giving them, again, just enough, giving them a small bite so that they can actually figure out the bigger ideas. Verbally link previous work and the new need to know ideas. So what have they done and what new things do they need to know and how can I connect them verbally so students become aware of that. If we say it, they pay more attention to it. Be explicit with your new vocabulary, but don't give them too much. Front loading all the vocabulary doesn't help students, but giving them 1 or 2 vocabulary terms that are going to be key to the activity can be helpful in that sense-making process. Link new conceptual ideas to concrete examples or metaphors. Give different representations, at least 2 of the same concept so students can make connections. Do check-in questions as you go through this, making sure students are not getting lost in what you're saying and are still understanding the connection to what you are doing. And then incorporate the time to ask what's puzzling you and what do we still need to know. And then after you present these new ideas to reason with, immediately following that, you're going to want to engage them in that sense-making activity. So this shouldn't end a lesson and then the next day, you have to do it all over again. This should be at the start of your period or block of time, and then you engage them in that activity. So the next slide talks about engaging with data or observations. And so on the slide, we're giving you examples of discourse that can happen, of questions that the teachers can pose based on student understanding. So in order to do this, you'll have to have students working with their peers in small groups. And as they're working in small groups, your goal as the teacher and facilitator of this lesson is to check in with them on their current thinking. So you're going to do 2 laps of the classroom. In the first lap, you're going to ask questions that probe more of their thinking or redirect them to some part of the activity that they are working with that is really important to further their understanding. So this is your temperature check. This is where you're getting your gauge of where your students are and what they're understanding. The second time you go around, You're assessing whether they understand how this is connecting to that big idea for the unit or the anchoring event. So again, on the slide, you can see examples that could be helpful as you're engaging in these 2 laps around the classroom. So on the next slide, after doing your 2 laps, then you come back as a whole group and have a whole group discussion. During this discussion, the goal is to help students see broad trends or patterns of data for different groups in the classroom and make connections back to that big idea. This is where you have students do pair shares as well. You're going to want to incorporate different strategies for that discourse. So again, an example of what students may be doing and then what you as a teacher can do. So the last component of this practice is using models or using all of our newfound knowledge to revise our models and explanations. So it's important to have a summary table for students to monitor and track their learning. So I know we give an example, we'll show the example on the next slide, but this is where students have the opportunity to really go back and say, hey, for my explanation, what do I have to have in it? And add, revise to that gotta have checklist, where they can go back to their small group models and see what needs to be added or what can be changed or taken away. And then going back to that class list of hypotheses and saying, do all of these still make sense based on this new information that we have, which could lead to shortening or adapting that list. So the next slide shows a sample summary table, which a phenomenon unit chart. So you can see, you can put the phenomenon at the top, naming it. Then you list the activity. What did you do during that activity? What did you learn during that activity? And how does this help us explain our phenomenon? And after getting feedback from a lot of middle school teachers, vocabulary, and I know as a former high school teacher, this is huge too. Key vocabulary is important. So the key vocabulary that came out of that learning activity. So maybe it was from the ideas you presented at the beginning, but having that reference there and having this accessible to students. And this is a digital version. You could always do, chart paper. There are many different ways you can do this, but somewhere where you're charting learning so students remember, oh yeah, 3 lessons ago we did this and this is what we learned from it. So we're going to look at an example of all of this coming together. So we're looking at our middle school unit for bread. Our anchoring phenomenon is bread, and showing these 2 pictures of bread where one has risen and one has not. And the anchoring questions, which you guys had previously seen, what happens in yeast that makes bread rise, and why does the yeast do this? So from this, they were asked to look at this picture, and then they were told to develop an initial model. And you can see it was very simplified, right? Given the rising and not. So why did the bread get fluffy and why didn't it? And students were asked to simply put their thoughts down. Then students were given a sense-making activities. So now you can see this was activity 4 in a series of activities that students were engaged in. The learning target was to use evidence to infer that what the gas yeast produces. So the key learning and then the connection to the phenomenon. So this is really what students need to know in order to understand why some bread rises and why bread doesn't. So then after completing the activity, the teacher used in what they called an activity log to chart the learning. So again, this is another version. Craig, if we go to the next slide. This is another version of that summary table, hard copy. So what did we do? What did we learn? And how does it connect? So did learn connect, where they also have that anchoring question at the top. So
I got a quick question. On that, I know the anchoring question, but I forgot. What is the phenomenon for this activity?
The phenomenon is like the picture. So that bread rises versus not. So why would some bread rise and why would other bread not rise?
Yeah, but to me, that's not a phenomenon for a unit or anything. I mean, what was this attached to a unit? And what would that phenomenon be? Because when I see the HMH book, sometimes they have phenomenon just for that local thing, but to me, a phenomenon is like maybe how does the fossil record document geologic time? But to me, this is more like the phenomenon is more of an anchoring question, but not a phenomenon, or am I just not getting it?
So Lillian put in the chat the actual, the unit that they do for the bread unit. So you can see that the different concepts and the goal of the unit is to explain that, but they have to build a lot of different science ideas. Students have to understand a lot of different science ideas in order to build this understanding. So they have 3 different performance expectations that students will have mastered by the end of this unit. So it may not be as long as what an HMH unit would be, maybe a little bit shorter, but it's still a unit that takes several different sense-making activities and different big science ideas for students to be able to explain why this is happening.
So the topic for this one, the topic for this unit is cells and the parts of cells, and this is for 6th grade. And so and the phenomenon here is actually that there's 2 identical loaves of bread that were baked, except for one ingredient was different. That one of these loaves had yeast and the other one didn't. And so that the phenomenon is that the students are asking, well, what happened to make one fluffy and the other not fluffy? Is there something special about the yeast?
Okay.
Um,
I'm still trying to identify the difference between anchoring questions compared to an overarching phenomenon to a unit that is supposed to be over. But again, there's a big unit. I'm sure there's little lessons and there's phenomena on each lessons and stuff like that will all relate back to the bigger one. But it's just trying to organize how I want to go about with the new, NGS standard teaching, which is so much more investigative. But there's a time factor. Sorry about that, Lily. This time. Okay, but anyway.
No, thank you for the question.
Good. All right, let you go.
Christina also has a question to raise her hand.
Very quickly, when I think of yeast, I think 7th grade cellular respiration. So I know, Craig, you said that this was a 6th grade activity, but can we use it in 7th grade?
Is cellular respiration in 7th grade?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so now we're running low on time. So just to wrap up real quick. So after they do that, they produce their final models, and you can see the big difference in how these final models are produced and really student explanation and the complexity from everything that they've learned. And not all final models are the same. You can see kind of in one of the pictures, they have a little rubric. So they had criterion to follow, but they were able to present it in a way that made sense to them. So all in all, next slide, when you look at this, what happens is you have your anchoring phenomenon, and every investigation, every lesson is a piece of that puzzle. And I know Craig said that earlier. So every puzzle piece gets connected at the end to have that final explanation. So students make sense at multiple levels and are driven by their curiosity, and they get all of these pieces of the puzzle. So at the end of collecting all of those pieces, they have recreated this explanation for what's happening with this bread and are able to produce these beautiful final models or explanations.
We have a tool here that was produced by the Ambitious Science Teaching group, and this tool is going to be in the chat in a second here. And this tool helps you. It's a planning tool, and its purpose is to take you through the steps in planning to support ongoing changes in thinking. So step 1 is to provide students with an idea to use as leverage during the activity. It has some questions that you might ask. These are some general questions, and then it has a place for you to write down based on what you're planning to do next in your units, what is the unit that you're doing, what are the lessons that you're doing. You can pose some specific questions that you might ask your students. Then it has a place where you can list what you might listen for. It has a couple suggestions for you. You can add some more things of what you might listen to from your students. And then after you teach, a place to reflect what questions did I actually ask as I taught, and what discourse strategies did I use with my students. So that's step one. Step two is getting the activity started and helping students uncover observation and patterns. So we've got some general questions, place for you to write some specific ones, and then some questions to listen for. And then once again, going on to step three, helping students connect activity to an anchoring event. Might use the phenomena tracker that we saw on the last slide. And then how do you use that? What questions do you pose to help guide that thinking? Then step four, whole class coordination of students' ideas and their questions. And then step five, creating and revising a public record of student thinking. So on the second page of this, I'm going to skip this little activity here. And on the second page of this, then there are some rapid survey of student thinking, some reflection questions to help you think of what are the next steps to take in teaching and learning within the classroom. And then these questions will help you to craft the next lesson. You may know what the next lesson is, but this may help you to craft that lesson to help hit a particular need the students have, a particular partial understanding, or maybe even because they have some sort of alternate understanding that you might need to slide in some different lesson to help them figure out where they've gone in the wrong direction. So unfortunately for us, I'm sorry to say, we've run out of time, so we're going to just leave you with that and say thank you. The evaluation link is in the chat. Lillian just placed it there. If you could take a minute to give us some feedback so that we can make sure to craft what we're doing so that we're better meeting your needs. This was, once again, this is PD number 3. And then PD number 4 is coming up in the near future. And then Lillian, I think there's going to be a sign out link that Lillian has after the evaluation link. And thank you all for attending today. We know that you've got a huge job and that this is the second or third of a very long succession of difficult years. Thank you for all the time and energy that you're putting in to really help students make sense of this world.
Craig, I'm sorry, I can't find the sign out link.
I got it, Lily.
Oh, you got it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and just a quick little promo about the Headphone PD coming up. If you're available to join us on Saturday, February 26th, I believe.
Yes,
Yes.
that's right. Headphone PD live and in person.
Yes.
Here, if you're at a Southgate school, then we emailed you a flyer. And if you're not at a Southgate school, then the flyer is in the chat. Thank you all for coming. Please feel free to stay on if you have any questions for us.